Warning. The following content may contain elements that are not suitable for some audiences. Viewer discretion is advised.
Good morning, afternoon, evening, nighttime, 2 in the morning, 4 in the morning, whatever time it is where you are, when you're watching this, YouTube, Facebook, LinkedIn, and I don't know what else, some other fucking social platforms or whatever. Welcome to another episode of Whispered Insights, where we put the disclaimer to you straight up in the first minute of the show. Thanks for joining us today. Some of the words that you hear here are not suitable for audiences. Like they said in the podcast, if you prefer a beep version, I don't know where you're going to find it, but try to find it anyways. We have a good one today. We have a good one next week. And the best part of today is that I am not going to be part of the show. So you get to hear a really good conversation between smart people without my stupid questions getting in the way. You're going to hear good questions from Alan. You're going to have some fantastic insights from Lauren. And then you're going to hear good questions from Lauren and fantastic insights from Alan. And back and forth until the time comes up when I'm going to say, that's all, folks. And the day is going to be over. Next week, before I forget, next week, Jonathan Becker, CEO of the San Jose Sharks, former CMO for SAP, and a good friend and a freaking intelligent human being like there's no other, who understands more about data than most of us will ever be exposed to, is going to join me to talk about, hopefully, data. I have a conversation with him later today to define what we're going to talk about. So for all I know, we may end up talking about hockey, which I love more than anything in the world. So it's going to be a great conversation, hockey. Anyways, with that in mind, let's talk about today. Today is about collective memory. And if I got that wrong, they're going to correct me very soon. But collective memory. And I think that it's going to be an incredibly interesting show because it brings to the front the idea that your community has value. I know, who knew communities with value? When you got people working together towards something, building value out of that is kind of fantastic. But we have two of the smartest people I know, two very good friends of mine. And I'm going to bring him in no particular order. First, Lauren, welcome. And
Hello.
then Alan, welcome. And,
Hello.
Hello. Like I said, I won't be here. So in about 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, the stage.
Hey, Alan.
Yay. I don't think we're going to need the disclaimer for us. But
No, we can be fairly tame, right? I mean, well, for now.
I think so. So for me, this conversation was born out of the episode that Esteban did at the end of the year where we were just talking about end of the year insights. And at the end of it, I think it was literally in the summary, like what's your last thing? You said collective memory. And I'm like, wait, what? And then we cut off. And I thought that it would be really great to have a conversation about what it means. It relates to so much that both you and I have done over the years. Mm-hmm. I mean, we met many years ago on a panel about community. And you've forgotten more about community than I will ever know.
No.
But at the same time, the work I've done on corporate narrative and corporate storytelling, and there's a concept I call foundational narrative. I think it relates a lot to it. So maybe to start us off, why don't you give us the thumbnail, the TLDR. What's the slang? I don't know what slang to use. The ChatGPT version of collective memory. Yeah.
Which is actually why so when we ended that really awesome super episode with everybody at the end of the year, I think the question was posed, like, what do you want to focus on, or what's inspiring you in the next year? And I said, one of the things that I'm most interested in, or keep being interested in, is collective memory. And one of the reasons why I'm fascinated by collective memory is in part because of kind of the mainstream wide fascination with ChatGPT, and that it is helping craft or shape how information is packaged. And for me, as somebody that helps stewards communities, designs communities, organizational and other types of community structures, when we talk about collective memory, it is really it is the culmination of all of the knowledge, all of the information, the shared experiences, stories, practices, processes that really help associate or shape a group's identity, culture, and history. And collective memory encompasses both individual memory as well as that co-constructed nature of a group, of a shared experience, or co-creating that memory or continuing to create those memories. And so when I think about collective memory, I'm thinking about it at the intersection of organizational memory. I'm thinking about what it means in digital communities and digital workplaces, and how does all of that kind of get thrown on its head when we start figuring out different ways in which all of our information gets, surfaced up or served up in a different way, maybe without that human nuance or complete with the bias that it was trained with. And what does that entail? And so for me, thinking about that intersection, I think in a bit more detail this year is kind of one of the things that I'm, just doing on the side of my desk.
From there's explicit knowledge and intrinsic knowledge that people have or that organizations have. Your first day in a new community, your first day at a new job, your first day, going to school, whatever it is, there's already a body of habits, practices, do's and don'ts. How do let's talk about it from a corporate point of view, because I think that's probably a best one for our audience.
Yeah.
When you start an organization, they throw you some orientation. Maybe you get some casual conversations over a cup of coffee, whether it's in person or on Zoom or some other way. And people say, oh, here's where you go to get your coffee. Here's what happens on Fridays. Here's what we do. Hey, you've never been to a sales kickoff. This is what it's all about. That's not documented anywhere.
No, it isn't.
But yet it's a critical part of how organizations operate. But how do you manage it? How do you track it? How do you engage it? It's not on OKR. It's not on an FAQ. It's not in the employee handbook, or should it be? Or how do we make it? I think that's kind of what I'm thinking is, how do we get it there, or how do we help people get that information?
Well, I think part of helping people get the information is making it explicit. So it could be that when you are putting something in an employee handbook, you are not just talking about it in theory or in abstract. You're actually pulling out examples and you're updating them, and you are showing what this looks like. What does accountability actually look like, right? What are the consequences of your actions? Where do we work from a place of abundance? Not just looking at all the negative aspects, but what are those positive aspects? What does it actually look for, to be in good practice? But that type of structure is great. But when we can start to model this behavior in everyday practices, where we look at the mundane and celebrate the mundane, I think that's when it starts to get really interesting, right? It's when, and I've heard you talk about this with Esteban before, working out loud, right? Narrating our work while we are doing it. The good, the bad, the ugly, the questions, the unknowns, the uncertainties, and making it a practice, not just to, share that information out, but to collectively sense make together. If you post something, I'm going back and I'm reflecting on it. I'm going, oh, wow, Alan did this and he's got these questions. I've got the same questions, or we've got the same blockers, or, he's doing something over here. I didn't even think about how it might impact over here. So it's thinking about different ways in which we can pool together our experiences to shape them into new things. We just don't spend enough time, looking at how the past informs our present and impacts the decisions we're making for the future.
For good and bad. I mean,
oh yeah.
One of the things is that you hear this all the time. Somebody comes in with a new idea, and everybody in the organization says, "Oh, no, we tried that.
Of
We've
course,
done
yeah.
that." And that element of the culture is, first of all, it's anecdotal. It's highly subjective, and it doesn't take into account the fact that someone can bring in a new perspective that means it could be successful this time, or we do it a different way. And so I thinking about collective memory, it's not just, hey, let's have a knowledge base of every conversation that's ever had. But I think you have to put some, like you said, some sense making around it, which is understanding the context of what happened. And why we tried this 5 years ago, yes, but 5 years ago we were in a different place. We had different,
exactly.
Right. And so why didn't it work, or what was, did we get a different outcome? The challenge is capturing that context. Organizations don't capture context; they capture the end result. Here's the summary of the decisions, or here's how we executed on something. Right?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I've most used in my career in all capacities, both as like a practitioner, a researcher, a consultant, is the very first thing I do when I come onto a project or into a new workplace is I have templates of, here's everything I've learned. Here's, what happened while I was learning it. And, I have like a private version, which is like kind of my journal of sanity. And I can kind of go back and rethink and reflect and reframe and reimagine. But also there's the more transparent version, which is, how am I working out loud for folks to model the behavior that's being sought here? And how do I showcase how those contexts and conditions can be captured and how our changing can change over time? And that is absolutely okay. That's part of a learning process. It's part of how we interact as humans.
It's the changing over time that actually. So years ago, I worked on Wall Street, and my first day, this was my first job out of college, and my first day on the job, I showed up at 8:30. Everybody had already been there for an hour.
Yeah.
So what did I do my second day on the job? I got there earlier, and that because it wasn't in the employee handbook that you have to be there at 7:30. It was, in fact, I probably said, if I looked at it, it probably said 9:00. I don't know. But there was this, I was able to capture that collective sense of this is how we do things here, for good or bad. And then the challenge becomes when those become habits, or they're ingrained, how do you do organizational change, which is one of the hardest things to do. So on the one hand, it's great to capture it, but on the other hand, it's how do you move it forward, or
how do you alter,
where do people,
right? Like how do you alter like atomic behavior, right? But I think the only way you can do that is first to observe what the behavior is. If you don't know what the behavior is, you don't know what those rules, those norms, especially the implicit ones are, you're never going to be able to make any type of change, right?
Right. So let's talk about those behaviors. One of them you mentioned was work out loud. And that creates, essentially that creates a record, but there's only a small portion of what's in my head that's going to end up on a piece of paper. If you've worked in an organization for 10 years, you've seen, and particularly the last 10 years, which have seen so much change and so much challenges, there's a lot in your head that nobody knows, and maybe nobody ever knows, and maybe they don't even need to know. Besides working out loud, and maybe we can talk about what working out loud means, because that, to me, it's how do I, particularly work, I was always a remote worker, at least for the last decade. And so I wanted to make it so that it was easy for people to work with me and they knew what I was doing. I didn't want to be out of sight, out of mind. I trolled people's calendars. That was one of my favorite things to do because, in 10 years, I would ask the question, in all the 10 years I would ask the question, hey, I see you're having a meeting about something. Can I be in? The answer was never no. The answer was usually, oh yeah, we forgot. Yeah, you should definitely be there. And so setting up the rules of engagement, but also having people understand what each other's doing. What are what besides working out loud, or maybe digging into what working out loud means and how that can help the rest of the organization?
Yeah, well, I think let's start with working out loud first, because I did the exact same thing. I was working remote for quite some time, and that's, I think, where I really kind of honed my skills. But where I found it, I actually started practicing it first when I was working for the Department of Defense, and I, had to work across the globe, different time zones. And while my main team, was located, physically in the office with me, I still needed to make sure that everybody knew what was happening and why. And so clearly communicating in a space where anybody could look at it asynchronously was just kind of par for the course. Now, narrating your work, there are some, it's not just saying, oh, I did X, Y, Z. It's really thinking about, okay, well, I did this, and this was the purpose behind it. This was how long it actually took me compared to what I actually thought it was going to take me. Oh, by the way, I needed to talk with these individuals to help me kind of wrap my head around this particular thing. And I came up with these particular obstacles. I've solved 2 out of the 3. I'm still working on the 3rd. I've got some of these open questions, right? So you see, it's almost like a math problem. I'm not just solving the problem. I know what 2 + 2 is. And I'm assuming you know what 2 + 2 is. But what I'm letting you know is my process of how I actually got to that point. And I think that's a skill. That's a practice, right? And then there's doing that on a project basis, just trying to get people to know who you are and what you do. Usually when I'm working with new teams, the very first thing I do is we find out, what are the best channels, what are the best mediums for communication. So we do a lot of observation first before we do anything. And then I ask people, okay, record a video about how you did that one thing. Well, everybody knows, that I do this. Actually, probably not, but, and it's not just, do they know what you are doing? Do they know exactly how you did that? Like, I know it's probably a really well-known example, but when I managed really big social media teams for these large corporate organizations, they thought, oh, it's so simple, right? You just post that on Facebook, on Instagram. That's like 5 minutes, right? Like absolutely nothing. No, let's actually show what that work looks like. Let's document what it looks like, and not just like a day in the life, but actually looking at from feature and function and responsibility. When you start to think about things in terms of accountability and alignment to goal and illustrating how that's done, that can be really interesting. So that's how you turn, process into corporate memory, is you take those things that are like a structured sequence, and you start to showcase where there are different practices that help shape that process. And then you put it out into the knowledge management, sphere, or however you're kind of keeping that information or sharing that information. So that's part of working out loud.
From that question, I think one of the challenges is, what does that knowledge repository look like, or what are its capabilities? Because it tends to be fragmented or stale. Mm-hmm. You really can't get both. Meaning, if you have a centralized repository, it tends to get stale. If you have active real-time repositories, they're fragmented. It's hard to keep them connected. I think that's where we get some value out of some of this large language model technology that allows you to summarize or connect or get a better layer of discovery over knowledge. But another piece of what you were talking about, working out loud, is it has to be, particularly if you were working cross organizations, cross silos, you made connections. You basically said, hey, Lauren, I've been working with Esteban on this piece over here, and you two should be talking to each other because you're working on the same thing, or what you're working on is related. Would you consider that part of collective memory, or how does that fit in?
Right, because everything that we do, everything that we experience is shaped in relation to others, right? So we're not doing it. Collective memory, like I said, has encompasses both our individual experience and memory, that capacity, but where it really takes hold, where it takes shape and becomes ingrained not just in us, but in the group, community, organization that we're in. It's in relation to another. So that's part of that collective sense making, right? It's replacing your original memories. It's adding an additional layer of detail, right? Of thought, of perspective, of opinion. And so it's, how do you continue to calibrate, those memories, and not just take them as is, but also being hyper aware that they are dynamic in nature.
Right. And look, a leader, a senior level leader comes into an organization, and they're brought in for a reason. Whether it's they're on the sales side, the marketing side, the product side, the HR side, whatever their function is, they were brought in most likely to hit some goal that's on part of some OKR for the organization, and their skill set, their experience, their whatever it is, that's why they're brought in. But they can't just do what they did somewhere else, right?
No.
They have to figure out. They have to do some sense making and find a way to take whatever the frameworks they have in their head, or whatever their knowledge of executing. How does that relate to my current organization? And I think that's a big challenge. I know that I had tons of conversations with leaders when they started, and I had one friend of mine. She heads up competitive intelligence for Freshworks. She did a 30 for 30. Tracy Berry. She did a 30 for 30. She had 30-minute interviews. That's a lot of time spent. Now, I'm not saying that it wasn't valuable, but is there a better way that we can do that? I think that, to me, that's actually an interesting problem to solve, right? How do you help someone who just joins get up to speed on the collective memory of the organization?
I think there can be a bit of a checklist, but it's still the responsibility, right, of that person, of that leader, to do the hard work and to listen and to navigate. It's not just going to be served up for you, because you also need to understand how you experience that collective memory, because there might be a different response or reaction based upon your role, your functionality, or the way that you enter that particular space or that conversation. So I don't think anything replaces that human to human interaction. So I've done the same thing. Like, I usually have 100 days of listening, but it doesn't necessarily mean I'm just in, face-to-face interaction. That means I'm looking to see, I'm looking at the digital workplace. I'm looking to see whose name pops up more often, who's always on stage, whose names are on decks, who's publishing things, whose voices are not included, right? Who's, taking those notes, who is, all of the different components, right? Who's leading the different ceremonies or rituals or retrospectives. And so it's really thinking about the space between and using that to kind of amplify what is not explicitly written down or derived. And you can only get so much from an individual's accounts, right? So yes, there's a lot that I can get from having a one-on-one with you, but in seeing things in aggregate, in seeing how a group actually swarms, or for good and bad purposes, swarms around a particular project or idea or opinion, speaks volumes. And you've got to be able to experience that, or be able to try to surface those behaviors, motivations, and understandings.
It seems ephemeral, just like a culture. Corporate culture, organizational culture is ephemeral. It's sort of one of those things of, you ask three people, you get four different opinions of what the culture is. And it's hard to within an organization, who owns the culture, whose responsibility is to be the help document and define and safeguard and and nurture or curate, or whatever the word that you want to use, I think it's the same thing for the collective memory, maybe institutional memory. Is that a okay synonym, or is that a little different?
Oh yeah, yeah. I usually say organizational memory, but yeah, yeah.
All right, but who owns it? Because if nobody owns it, then it's hard for someone to what's the word I'm looking for when you shepherd it, you curate, you safeguard it. I can't think of a better word. It'll come to me.
I think, and I know this might be kind of a cop out, but I do think everybody owns it. Like we have to all take responsibility for how we are shaping the spaces that we belong to. And I think a lot of what I've experienced in the past is that people don't believe that they own those spaces, or they have a right to that space, or a right to shape it. And my job as a community steward, as somebody that is helping design these spaces, is to ensure that there's a more leaderful approach, and that there's not one single owner, but that we're all taking ownership because there's a shared accountability. But and I saw this comment in the chat as well that was just popped up. Taking this type of approach is not met with, a lot of, parades and flowers and, oh my gosh, this is the right way to do things. Because there's a lot of fear wrapped up in that, because all of a sudden you're exposing, right, things that, time maybe not managed well, or processes that are outdated, or where people's voices aren't being elevated, and that there are structural inequities. There's a lot going on, right, in these situations. And so when you are working out loud, you really do have a target on your back until you start, well, I don't know if it's until, but you definitely have that in the beginning as you're working to build it into a practice. Because sometimes it can be thought of as, a performance, but you have to actually model why it's important, and how it starts to change behavior, and how it starts to change that mundane and that practice. But it's definitely not something that is easily picked up, and it can easily go just like that. So you have to have it in practice, and you have to show the leaders have to actually be involved, not just the crowd.
And the question becomes, how do those leaders do it? Let me maybe take a step back, or at least go back to the beginning. When I do work for corporate storytelling, one of the things that we try to identify is what we call a foundational narrative. What is the reason that you exist as an organization? What do you have to give to the world? How do you serve it? Are there foundational memory? Meaning, is that related to how? And the reason why I bring that up, because you need guidelines, or not guidelines, let's call them guideposts. You need to help you navigate how you participate in the whole process, right? So, what would be an analog for that from a foundational narrative point of view?
Well, I mean, it's the stories we're telling ourselves about about why we're making certain decisions, right? So it's like, so it can be something that's fed down, through the organization. It could be something that is kind of like a shadow type organization, goal or objective. And those are pretty dangerous, because if you're not making those explicit, then, there's a lot of crossed wires and duplicate work and misunderstandings that definitely occur. But I think that it's how we, it's the stories we tell ourselves. It's the stories we're sharing with each other. It's the both, right? The collective memory is the stories we're telling ourselves, and the stories that then we share with others. And some of those are based on what we want people to see about ourselves, and through our work, and how what we are doing aligns with that organization's goals or objectives. And we kind of stretch the truth, or stretch the connection a bit. Or it's truly what we believe, and how, we've been taught, from our experience, our lived experience, as well as the lived experience of others that are passing it down to us. Yeah. Oh gosh, that's a big one right there. Foundational memories collective.
I'm going to hold that one because I have a different thought that I want to go because to me, let's say you have somebody who works at an organization for 15 years. Mm-hmm. And let's say that technology is the way it is today. So there's email, there's Slack, there's your Dropbox, Google Drive, or wherever you're storing your information. There's meetings, there's calendar, there's all sorts of, and there's bodies of work that the person has produced over 15 years. When they leave, mm-hmm. What do I want to keep? And what, meaning with so much information, how do I separate the signal from the noise? What makes sense, or how do I capture what's valuable as part of that collective memory? When they leave, you lose it. There's knowledge lost through attrition. It happens because they have relationships, and those relationships help make things happen. Just because they know somebody, something happens, whereas the person who comes and replaces them doesn't know, and so they can't necessarily do the same thing. That's part of the collective. So if we could identify what would we want to capture, and then maybe we can talk about how to capture it, or at least how do we keep it.
Well, I mean, first off, you don't leave those types of discussions until right before they retire or they leave the company, right? You can't get everything from an exit interview. So that's why you have to build in a practice of this type of work immediately. It has to be ongoing. How and why they make decisions, I think, is incredibly valuable, right? Because then we pair that with the context and conditions, and we start to see how a story, begins to take shape. What did you learn from those decisions? I love to be able to map, from different projects or different developments across not just a career trajectory, but across an entire team or department's trajectory or an organization, and thinking about, okay, well, if we know how you made decisions, why you made those various decisions, what did you learn from those experiences? Now, based upon that, how did it help shape or evolve or grow your other work? If we see that the same mistakes are happening over and over again, right? Do we tie it back to an individual's performance? Do we tie it back to the way that a team coalesced or swarmed around a particular challenge or project or product? So I think the how and the why, the learnings, and then how those learnings were actually put into action, how those insights turned into some type of action or shaped decision making. That's kind of like the third ingredient or the third kind of key. What about you? What do you think should be part of that?
So I'm going to create a role. I'm going to call it the Chief Sociology Officer.
Yeah.
And I'm going to say that the role of the Chief Sociology Officer is actually to map out the relationships and this decision making, and even yes, more chiefs. Well, I don't know who. Look, maybe it's a role, not necessarily an actual job title, but it's mapping out there's a lot of intangibles, and so that's why I said sociology. It's because it's about the relationships. And when you talk about swarming or teams coming together to solve a problem, or you have a big event, you have a product launch, you have a crisis that you need to come together to address. Very often the postmortem is about who made a mistake, and who do we blame, and how do we make sure that it doesn't happen again. But I'd love to see the analysis of how the problem was solved. My background is in IT support. I love the metaphor of the alarm goes off and I'm the fireman sliding down the pole and going to solve a problem. And, whatever the problem was, we're going to figure out what happened, and then we're going to figure out a way to fix it. But we rarely look at the sociology of addressing it?
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because one of my favorite things, and I am slowly unlearning a lot of, well, I mean, I got my career started working for the Department of Defense. So I'm working, with federal government military folks, so structure was kind of the game. And so I've had, some of that was really great to kind of carry through into my career. Other things I've had to kind of let go along the way. But one of the things that I've kept are after action reports. And one of the things that I've always done with my teams is and I hate performance reviews, and we could have a whole other discussion around the pros and cons and the ugliness around calibration and performance reviews. But one of the things that I would always do with my teams is I would say, I'm not looking to rack up all of your successes. I want to look at every single one of our after action reports. And I want to look at all of those unanswered questions and problems and difficulties. And I want to know exactly how you took that learning, how you took that insight, and how either you solved for it, or you took the steps in order to ensure that it never happened again, or we did something better to put in place. And that's how I scored my team. And that that was not something that was definitely something we did individually, but we calibrated as a team. We put them all on the table and we said, hey, we are only as good as the person sitting next to us. So we need to ensure where we're all moving. And I found like that was really, really helpful. But that's not norm in most teams to be able to kind of flip that thinking or that frame of mind.
So it makes me think of, how do we measure success with collective memory? One of my favorite things whenever you start something is, well, what are the metrics, or at least how are you going to measure it? Part of it may be, can we see that, we don't make the same mistakes again, or here's something we learned that we were able to apply to other situations. How would you look at success measurements? I hate to say metrics because we don't need more metrics, because metrics just means you're just going to.
I do like to pay attention to how many questions are being asked, right? And the types of questions, right? Are you actually searching for that information? Are you not able to find that information? Are you asking a question that requires critical thought? I think the more questions, the more curious a group, a community, an organization can get, I think that's when you start to get the real the real return from collective memory, because then it's helping you inform your present thinking, so that you can start to remember the future together, in various ways, and thinking about different alternative futures and perspectives. So yeah, I would maybe look at the questions for sure. Also the care and compassion, which I know is subjective, and I don't want to kind of get into like how we start to measure semantics, and I think we kind of touched a bit on this, when we were talking in the big discussion, before the end of the year, is there's a care, compassion, and grace, and finding ways to show that in practice as people are absorbing new information about their context or learnings, or understanding how that collective memory is shaping how work gets done in the organization. I think we need to. I think we need to be mindful of what that behavior, what that language actually looks like.
So we're going to start to get into a creepiness factor a little bit here, but we talk about. I was in the customer experience space and trying to do sentiment analysis on somebody who's calling up. Trying to reach out to a help desk, and are they, really angry? Are they really really angry? Are they just frustrated, or whatever it is? But it seems to me we could do a sentiment analysis just on the conversations, on the emails, the Slack messages, even just how people are writing their notes or their reports or their some executive summaries. You could get a sense of where an organization is and how it's feeling. 3/4 of down numbers is going to have different types of executive summaries than 3/4 of up numbers, right? But that sentiment, you're right. I think that sentiment is part of the collective memory as well, which is where are we as an organization, and what do we have to inject into it? But from a measurement point of view, that's one way, sentiment. I think that, like I said, it could be a little creepy. No, not could be. It has the, that's a,
Yeah,
an
we haven't
element
really cracked that. Yeah.
that we'd have to play with. But one of the things that I know you've worked a lot with is internal communities, and an element of if you simplify it, let's say I had an internal Reddit, right, and somebody put up a question, and people all over the organization answered questions. There's a lot of value there because that's how you can unlock some of this collective memory, because it's stuff that's not documented, but somebody has an answer for it. The challenge with that is participating in a community and sharing my intrinsic knowledge is not part of my OKR. Building relationships across organizations to the point where I can be more effective is, it seems like an obvious thing to do, but again, it takes time, it takes a focus, and it's not part of my OKR. And at the end of the year, I won't say, hey, look, I built relationships with 8 parts of my organization, 8 other organizations that have been helping me be effective. And they'll say, great. So did you hit your numbers? Or, how was the product launch, right? And it's hard to correlate that. I feel like we need a way to correlate these more socially related activities that are unlocking this collective sense making, that we don't really have a way to do that.
Well, it's not that we don't have a way to do it. We haven't prioritized that as something we should be, measuring with the same weight, the same value, or consistently across the board. And I think that is a real problem, because the more, I think it was, I can't remember the name of the book now, but it was like the nine laws of work or something like that. It came out, I don't know, maybe like in 2017, 2018. And it had a really interesting list of different factors that if you were to ask those of people, you could get a better understanding of how work is or isn't getting done, and their performance in not just an individual capacity, but as a part of a group capacity. Because, just like we could have a whole show about sentiment and how difficult sentiment is to measure, if it is even at all possible to measure. The same thing kind of goes for, work in relationship with others. 360-degree, feedback is just something that I could just rant all day long about. So I think there's a lot of things that we need to do. But we do have to measure it. We do need to put it up as something that is part of how we are evaluated. And right now it is just strictly about some of, those superficial metrics or diagnostics, rather than the work is actually getting done in the organization because of those relationships, or maybe not getting done because of those relationships. And so we need to find a way in order to really sink our teeth into what does that look like? How do we strengthen those ties? How do we help collaboration and communication? But until, we kind of go, past the superficial, and it's not tracking every single person's activity, and having kind of a arm's length, distance from it. It's really thinking about, well, how is this shaping work over the long period? Because I think there's also the problem that we're trying to get short-term fixes, immediate fixes in different workplace cultures, internal communities. And you and I both know that when you're trying to change a community, that is not something that is done overnight. That takes a long time to move that particular needle. But we're not elevating the things that are actually going to move our communities.
So one of the things I'd like to measure, if you talk about metrics, and this is, I'm not a data scientist or a sociologist or a psychologist or anything. Anecdotally, I had a practice where I would just have I put random, coffee chats on people's calendars. and it was always cross organization. It could be a SDR, it could be a leader of a product unit, whatever it is. And I would just reach out and say, hey, Lauren, you mind if I put some time in your calendar for a cup of coffee, no agenda, just to chat? And anecdotally, that was invaluable for me. It helped me build a network. It helped me understand how different parts of the organization worked and made it, and granted my role, it was important for me to know how most of the organization worked, but that doesn't mean that it's not important for other people. Mm-hmm. I would love to have a study about the efficacy of that in terms of the time spent versus the value given back. Because to me, that's unlocking collective memory, right?
Yeah. I actually invited people to play games in my office, or like, even if they weren't like physically, in the same space, find like an online game or something that we could do together. I also found that was a really interesting way to get people to open up and to talk beyond just kind of the work capacity and to figure out how their brain actually worked. So I could tell like if somebody was a little bit more, kind of closely guarded, or if they were really, Machiavellian in their moves, and so to speak. And right. It was a really interesting way to get to know people and their various styles, and to, be a bit more playful in a serious environment.
Well, first of all, my family won't play Clue with me anymore.
Oh, no.
Because I just, they would have asked this person that thing if they had that card. I play that whole game in my head, and I figure it out way before anybody else. So they won't play with me anymore. But that's part of, part of that is culture. Part of that is collective memory. What do you think you'd want to be able to, what could you take away from it if you had to, for lack of a better term, make it into systematize it, or make it part of a program within the organization? Hey, we're all going to play games.
What do we get out of it?
Meaning, how do you think, if you had to put, I got to show value, right? Meaning, yes, we'll all play games, and again, subjectively, we think it's going to have value.
Well, we start to learn how people make decisions. We, depending upon the game, is it more collaborative? Is it more individual? What do they have a choice? What choice do they make? Are they able to let go? Are they able to, have a sense of humor? Are they able to accept new terms or adapt to various environments, right? See, these types of things are really interesting and part of a game mechanics. And I hate kind of the gamification of a digital workplace. Right. But I do think the act of playing games with another adult is something that you can learn a vast amount about the people that you're working with.
I agree. All right, we don't have that much time left, so I have a little game for us to play, if it's okay with you.
Oh, no, okay.
It's not a game. So let's see if we can give specific takeaways. So let's say that you are an individual at an organization. What is, if you were going to advise somebody, or if they said, hey, what can I do right now to start improving the value or my participation in the collective memory, the institutional memory, the organizational memory of my organization? What would be the first step, or at least the approach that you'd give somebody, just as an individual contributor?
Yeah, individual contributor, two things. If you are part of a project, document, what you are doing in that project. Document why you are doing, how you are doing it, how that work starts to inform somebody else's, how somebody else's work informed yours. What are those obstacles? And take those into really snackable bits. What does that actually look like? And walk somebody through that project from your perspective. I think what's even more valuable than maybe a project perspective is taking a piece of your everyday work, something that everybody takes for granted that you do. They know, oh, Elle's on that, she's got it, whatever happens, it'll get done, right? But nobody knows exactly how I do it. So I'm going to take that one thing and I'm going to showcase what that actually looks like. What does that entail? Video, text, mixed media, it doesn't matter. Like, I'm going to figure out a way in order to communicate that. Take those 2 steps to start to model what it actually looks like, what you are doing and why you are doing it as an individual contributor.
I would add I love that. That trumps what I was going to say, but the way I look at it, it's similar. Is I would say explain to people what you do. Teach them how to do business with you.
Yes. Oh, communication preferences, right? Like, have a README file. First thing I do in an organization is I create a README file, right? Like, here's all the goodness that you get with me, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And this is how I best communicate. This is how I deal with conflict, that type of thing. Yeah.
Yeah. So teaching people how to do business with you, I think that would be my first step. Now let's talk about if you're a leader. And I just started at your organization, and collective memory and and institutional memory is important to you in terms of how you operate. What would your advice be to me, or what would you want me to take on as a maybe it's a skill, or maybe it's a process within the organization that's important, or something like that?
I don't know if it's necessarily a skill or a process, but I think I would make a list of not just the people that you would need to interact with, but the conversations that I would want you to follow, right? The places that I would want you to look without giving you a direct map. I would just say, I want you to try to find X, right? Or I want you to try to feel, where this particular vibe is, or give some directional sense, but don't give them a map of how to get there. And then ask, how did you get there? What did you observe? Were you able, to make any movement in here, and make it kind of a back and forth dialogue as that person is beginning to explore the environment that they're now in, right? Don't let them kind of sit on their own and try to brave that wilderness forever, but, have that collective sense making together. So give them a lay of the land and ask them to go find it on their own means.
I think that first 30 days or 90 days is so hard.
Yep.
And for no reason, because it's lonely, and it's almost like we're making everybody a pioneer. Every time they start something new, we make them go figure it out. Go figure out how to start a fire. Go make yourself a house. Go, cook, grow your food and whatever it is.
Exactly.
Would you do so? It's almost like this treasure hunt. Would you? So you do that based on the role and what the expectations of that person.
Exactly.
So mine is again similar, except I would bet on serendipity. I would go to the thing of look through each time you talk to somebody, ask them, is there someone else you think I should talk to?
Oh yeah, for sure. That's always a good one. Yeah.
But also, look for especially in a remote world. When you're in an office, you bump into somebody, getting a cup of coffee, or if there's a, cafeteria or whatever, or just walking past their desk, you overhear a conversation. But try to just reach out to random people within the organization, and just with that strategy I said, which is no agenda, just having it, and when I found that when you ask people open-ended, tell me about yourself, it's a much different conversation. And you learn about what they feel, as opposed to what they're working on right now. You get a bigger picture of how they see their role within the organization, or how they see how they can be effective, or even how you can see how I can be more effective, because you've dealt with my part of the organization before, and it's like, oh yeah, I'm in legal and you're in sales. It's like, oh, I always have these problems when tell me about that. These are things that I can learn. But those are serendipities that just don't happen unless you put yourself in the position to get it. And that to me is unlocking collective memory.
Oh, I really like this question. How do you do it in a structured mode? Because I think that's really important, because you have to kind of you have to factor in information architecture, digital workplace design, community design. Like, none of these things can be thought of in a silo, and it can't just be a free for all. One of the organizations, I will not name them, brought me in to wrangle their internal digital workplace, and they had over 100,000 microsites. And there was like, every person in the organization could have had, 2 or 3 on their own. It was like absolutely a complete nightmare. And it becomes this digital wasteland, right? And so people don't necessarily like structure, but when we're thinking about collective memory, there are ways in which you don't have to take a heavy hand. There are ways in which you can design the information architecture, the community spaces to allow for those forms of conversation. Also thinking about, how are you documenting the information? So we talked about those after action reports. What questions are you asking? What's the valuable information that you're going to take away? What information are you extracting to be used in other forms or in other ways? So really thinking about what that user story looks like is going to help you craft that design so that you can allow collective memory to happen, but to do so in the form of the structure that you've allowed or designed for.
I don't normally think that technology is a solution to a problem, but it's usually people, processes, and tools. And I think about discovery and search in particular has evolved. I remember when I switched from using Microsoft Office to a Gmail equivalent for the first time, I was still putting stuff in folders. Because when you're using Office, search was not that great, and so you put emails would come in, and you put it. This is project. I put that in, put it in folders, and if I needed to find something, I had a filing system. It evolved to the point where if I'm using Gmail, or even with Outlook, you can just I don't file stuff anymore. You just search, and search is really good. The technology, the promise of what. The unhyped version of AI is a layer on top of unstructured data, which is all the text and conversations and documents that we have that actually can allow us to you still have to ask the right questions. And I think
you can't strip out the context, the nuance. Yeah, right. There's some dynamics there, yeah.
But I feel like that if you want to talk about a structured way, it's start thinking about how you can put a structured layer on top of your unstructured data, and then being able to query it. But like you said, we're not quite there yet. There's definitely context. There's definitely missing pieces.
But you're right. You've got to have the foundation first. The foundation, and then understand where your unstructured data, what it looks like, how it's being shaped, and then you can put that layer on top.
All right. What's the last word on collective memory for today?
For today?
Well, it's not over, is it?
Well, no, definitely. I hope not. I think you do have to have an understanding of your collective memory before you can take any type of collective action or collective imagination. I think that's important.
My last word is it goes back to the foundational, what I call foundational narrative, and that foundational element of who you are as an organization. I think if you don't really know who you are to begin with, or why you're there, or what your purpose is, it's hard to put context around how your organization evolves and and pick out what's important and what's not along the way. So getting that foundation right, and it's not too late. Meaning, even if you didn't do it when you first started, you could still do it now, and at least come up with a semblance of what that means. Lauren, this was great.
Thanks, Alan. That was fun.
That was fun. Esteban, thank you for having us. We'll have to come back on and talk about something else at some point. But I always, and especially, we're going to have to go through the books on your shelf.
Oh, for sure. Anytime.
I think that's an episode in itself.
For sure. Yeah. All right. Thank you so much.
All right. Thanks, Lauren.